All right, welcome, colleagues, friends, students, to this keynote lecture of the Jean Monnet Network, European Transoceanic Encounters and Exchanges. It's a pleasure to introduce our keynote. I'm Gustavo Miller, a researcher at the University of Leuven, who is part of the ET network. I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote, Professor Yolanda Martinez San Miguel from the University of Miami. Professor Martinez San Miguel's scholarship links Latin American and Caribbean literature with colonial and post-colonial studies, therefore linking it with its relationships with Europe as a colonial and imperial power. In Miami, she teaches courses on critical theory, comparative coloniality, gender and sexuality studies, as well as Latin American and Caribbean studies. She recently co-edited a book entitled Contemporary Archipelagic Thinking Towards a New Comparative Methodology and Disciplinary Formations. She has also taught in her career at Princeton University, at Rutgers, at the State University of New Jersey, as well as at the University of Pennsylvania. Today, Professor Martinez San Miguel will talk to us about colonial archipelagic studies, a new research agenda for Caribbean studies. Before I give on the floor, let me just say a few words on how this is going to work. Professor San Miguel will speak for 45 minutes, which will be followed by a Q&A. The audience that's following us online can ask the questions at any time via the Q&A button that you're probably going to find at the bottom of your screen. We're going to be paying attention to that as well. Professor Martinez San Miguel, so many thanks for being with us today virtually. The floor is yours then, and we look forward to your lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and I hope you can hear me well. I want to thank the organizers for this invitation, and thank you for accommodating that I was unable to travel in person to join you there today. So I'm going to start with that short video, and then I will move into a PowerPoint with my presentation. Let me see if I can make this work.
There's a network of us, strung out about the world, the archipelago we're called, isolated above, but connected below. I ask someone I know, who asks someone they know, who asks, well, you get the gist. Sapiens invented Google in the 1990s. We've had it since the Neolithic.
How long does it take?
I'm looking for Cannibal.
So that's comes from Sense8, and it's actually one of the epigraphs for the anthology that on contemporary archipelagic thinking that was mentioned before. And so I'm going to jump in right away and start with the presentation in which I sort of like what I do is I share. Oh, hold on, let me see. Did I share the presentation? Let me just do that again. Okay, here we go. So I start with sort of like when I explain how I went from Caribbean studies to archipelagic studies and what was the kind of contribution and work that I thought I could make by making a connection between these two fields. You're seeing right now one of the first maps that we have of the Caribbean from 1511. And one of the things that called my attention as soon as I saw this representation of the Caribbean is that I don't see if you can see where I'm pointing at, but the Canary Islands appear together with the Caribbean. And this is not, this is not a coincidence. It's actually, it has to do with the ways in which, in the process of imperial expansion, archipelagic regions or centers of like collections of islands presented similar challenges to the different empires or metropoles that were trying to expand into regions that were far away and were therefore difficult to administer. And so throughout my investigations in Caribbean studies, one of the things that I do, this is more like a hobby than anything else, is that when I travel to any conference or any city, I will go to map collections in libraries and also some of the old map collection stores. And I will ask them what, if they had any maps of the Caribbean that they will want to share with me. And I found a series of maps by coincidence in which the Caribbean was described as the archipelago of Mexico. And so there's half a dozen that I have been able to locate, but that actually made me think about the notion of the archipelago in relationship to the Caribbean. And one of the questions that I wanted to explore is, obviously not taking the archipelago as a natural or geological formation, but actually as a social cultural formation. What was it that made the notion of the archipelago function? And particularly in what ways that could allow me to question some of the limits or limitations that I was seeing in the configuration of Caribbean studies as a field. And so in the exploration of this kind of question, I began to look at texts, some of them canonical, like Christopher Columbus's, and others less canonical, like the atlases that describe the world, the different parts of the world. And I was trying to trace the way in which networks of islands, or particularly the notion of collections of islands, was significant in the articulation of the descriptions that were rendered of the New World or of the Caribbean. And one of the questions that I was also interested in exploring was in what ways looking at islands as a particular unit of analysis will allow me to sort of like change the focus from continental studies, which is one of the questions that I asked myself as a PhD in Latin American studies that was interested in Caribbean studies is, what's the difference, right? Why do we have Caribbean studies as a different field? It's not only geographical, there's something more that is happening and that is articulating different disciplines. And so you have here a passage from Christopher Columbus' letters to Santangel, where he's describing Hispaniola, which is one of the first centers of operation of the Spanish Empire in the New World. And he's talking about it. One interesting thing about the way in which he's describing the islands is that then he starts finding obviously one island after the other. And so there is a whole conversation in many of these diaries and letters about the unit of the island on the one hand, and the significance that it may have administratively and politically in the process of expansion. So I found descriptions in texts that are more canonical. I also, as I mentioned before, began to review some of the atlases that you find from the 16th to the 18th century. And one thing that caught my attention was actually that this notion of the archipelago of Mexico appears in some of the atlases that I was working with, and also the notion of the Antilles as a significant unit of analysis, right? And it's interesting that one of the things that caught my attention from Moll's system of geography is that he talks about the Antilles as a part, of the different, as an important part or unit of the Americas that needs to be separated from the tierra firme or the terra firme, no? And so I will come back to this later, but I wanted to share those as very early examples, no? I am a native of Puerto Rico, and as a native of Puerto Rico, I come from one of the oldest colonies that is still in existence, right? And in our case, the insular cases are a very important piece of legislation that explains the particular status of the US Caribbean as territories that are considered part of the United States, but that they belong, but they're not part of the United States, meaning that in many aspects of our legal articulation, the Constitution, some of the rights of the Constitution do not follow the flag. So we're part of the United States, but we don't have the same rights as people that live in the continental United States. And interestingly enough, and probably most of you know this already, as soon as we move to the continental US, then we become, we have the same rights, right? So one of the questions that we ask ourselves is what is it that made the insular a unit of analysis, a legal unit of analysis that was significant for the insular cases, that actually made the US behave in a similar way than some of the European metropolis when they had to engage with the Caribbean more directly. One would think that these insular cases that were decided by the Supreme Court in between 1901 and 1922 will be a question of the past, but it's important to keep in mind that the insular cases continue to be used in recent cases that have to do with issues of citizenship and issues of economic autonomy. Basically, the basic premise in insular cases is the idea that these islands are territories that cannot have or enjoy the same kind of laws and benefits of a state. Some territories, all territories in principle were en route to become states. But in the case of the islands, the territory, the clause for the territory that is applied to them through the insular cases is different. So not all of them are en route to become states. And so that's another question that legal scholars have been engaging with. But for me as a literary scholar, the most important part is that some of these cases are still used to reach contemporary decisions about the US insular colonies. And so what am I doing with the archipelagic here? Basically, I entered Caribbean studies in a moment in which the field was dominated by social scientists, historians, and literary critics. And the field was in a process. I was in grad school at Berkeley in the 1990s. So the field was in a moment in which it was trying to articulate itself. And in that process of trying to form itself and to create a separation between Caribbean studies and other area studies, one of the things that I noticed is that when we look at the colonial experience, the separation of the Caribbean from other colonial regions, particularly insular regions, it's a disservice to the discipline. So I wanted to reconnect the Caribbean with other archipelagos that have experienced similar colonial experiences to try to see if there were some common tropes that could be analyzed from the cultural perspective, but also common ideas on ways of articulating political and cultural forms of identification. And so the other thing that I wanted to do when I was engaging with archipelagic studies is that in some fields, there is a distinction between continental studies, and they don't call it insular studies, but that's implicitly that's sort of like the opposition, right? And in fields like philosophy, there are fields like continental philosophy studies, but for those of us that come from islands, insular philosophy studies is sort of like it's always like a new field that is emerging. And that is something that I think it's also a kind of interrogation that I want to pose by looking at the idea of the insular, not as a lack or as a place of disadvantage, but as another place from which different kinds of questions can be asked. And finally, another thing, and this is why I shared the video from Sense8, another thing that I wanted to be able to explore is to think about the Caribbean as a very small region where there's a lot of multiple populations coming from very different parts of the world, multiple experiences of colonialism, some of them coinciding and some of them happening one after the other. And so what would happen if instead of separating the work that we're doing by language or by national focus, we were trying to basically look at the multifocal experiences or the multiplicity of experiences that are taking place in a region like the Caribbean. And then looking at other regions that are also collections of islands and networks of islands and seeing if there are some commonalities there. So that's as a way of an introduction. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the field of archipelago studies, because evidently when I entered this conversation, there was a field that existed. It was a very robust and interesting field where people in archaeology, geology, and political science, many people that were doing military studies and insular studies were present, and obviously many writers, thinkers, and artists. And so, as mentioned before, I was fortunate enough to co-edit with Michelle Stevens, my colleague Michelle Stevens, Contemporary Archipelagic Thinking. And one of the things that we tried to do in the introduction was actually review other ways of thinking about networks of locations, like system theory, actor network theory, and assemblages. And then ask ourselves, what is it that the notion of archipelago study contributes to the work that we're doing? Do we need a new term? No, what is it that it's for us productive, that maybe there is a dialogue with these other terms, but it makes for us more productive to actually engage with the people who are doing archipelagic studies. As I mentioned before, the field is very robust. There are many people working on these issues, many neologisms, words that, that are very useful for some of these scholars, and I'm not gonna review all of them here. We did try to do some review in the introduction to the anthology before we invited people, a series of, I think it's like 21 contributors from different disciplines, to think about the ways in which archipelagic studies enriches the work that they're doing in many different fields. And so when we think about archipelagos in the Caribbean, as I mentioned before, the term appears explicitly in some maps and in some texts, but it's also an implicit category that has been operating from very early on. And so we find, for example, an interesting detail that I found when I was doing some research in the case of the Caribbean, is that the indigenous populations that were established in the Caribbean before the arrival of the Europeans to the region, in some cases they established what was called cacicazgos in the Spanish Caribbean, and they were not limited to insular borders. A cacicazgo could include more than one island, and there was also a very active movement between islands and between the islands and the continental coast of Central America and South America. So for these populations, the separation between island and continent, or the idea of the island as a singular unit, was not necessarily operational. And so that's an area that I think is an interesting one that was an inspiration for us. And so in the work that I'm doing, I'm working particularly taking that as one of the notions. I don't want to be essentialist, but I think it's important to note that there has been this fluidity of populations moving across the region since very early on. And so then I worked with, as I mentioned before, with some maps where the notion of the archipelago is explicitly or implicitly presented, and then historical moments in the Caribbean, particularly the formation of confederations in the Caribbean, where the region has actually tried to create a unit of the several islands to actually think about the possibility of acting in concert for political purposes. And so those are the 3 points of departure of the kind of work that I'm trying to do right now. And so I have a working definition of archipelago, which is it doesn't necessarily coincide with islands only. It's actually networks of regions. It could be islands, ports, cities, forts, metropoles, communities. And the idea is that there has to be some relation and some desire of acting in concert. And as such, archipelagos can be formed, can dissolve, can exist for a certain amount of period. And so in a way, they're similar to constellations, that they could be humanly constructed, and we ascribe some meaning to that, and different cultures can ascribe different meanings to the same group of stars or constellations, if you will, right? And so I'm particularly interested in the set of relations. I do some review of political formations, but I'm not a political historian. I'm more like a cultural critic. So I'm more interested in the way in which the idea of these networks of locations or communities are represented culturally in a way that is calling for a bigger unit as a way of identification for the region. And so 3 questions that are informing my work: to move beyond the insular, to actually look at the islands in action or in relation, if you want, Many of you perhaps do not know Pedreira, who's a very important Puerto Rican thinker that thinks about the notion of the insularism, but more people know The Repeating Island by Benitez Rojo, no? And it's been a very productive point of departure for us to think the Caribbean. But my question is, what happens if we go beyond the notion of the island and think about Glissant's notion of the archipelagic thinking as a distinct form of knowing, as a distinct method, right? And then moving from the method, then think about the structure that takes in literary text. In particular, you know, what is the way in which the archipelagic is articulated in poetry, in narrative? Does it change the structure of a particular narrative? How is it that I can call a particular text archipelagic, and how does that particular lens add something to the kind of conversation that we can have about this text? So an overview of the book that I'm working on. It has 3 parts. The introduction, it actually takes as a point of departure the insular cases, but then it works on 3 different notions. The first is the maps, the notion of the cartographic, both the traditional map and also the literary, the notion of literary maps that Ricardo Padrón with the early modern period, and so I extended to the contemporary period. And I worked with a series of texts from the 16th through the 18th century, both maps and narrative text. And then in the second chapter, I focus on Antonio Martorell, who's a visual Puerto Rican artist, who has a series of texts, some of them a series of visual texts, some of them are about the archipelago directly, but others, for example, the Archipiélago de Letras, it's actually a collection of 28 different images that work as one unit and that try to talk about the Anglo, the Spanish, and the French Caribbean as one unit. And so he's using the archipelago both literally, explicitly, and also structurally in his works. The second section, which is the one that I'm going to be sharing with you briefly at the end of this presentation today, is the one on confederations, which is looking at 2 particular moments, one in the 19th century and the other in the 20th century, in which the Caribbean, or a region of the Caribbean, tries to create a federation, a group of islands that work as one political unit. And so I'm working with text produced or art produced during the time in which these confederations are taking place, and then text produced afterwards, going back to this historical moment as sort of like an utopian moment of Caribbean identification. And then the last section will work specifically on territories, and that's where I move from. I include the Caribbean in dialogue with Pacific studies. And so the idea is to look at the ways in which the fact of not being in many cases nations that are recognized as such, but being overseas territories, articulates a common aesthetic that in some cases, in some of the artists that I study is explicit. They actually connect with artists from different regions to actually talk about what is it to be a colony that is not necessarily a nation, but by being an overseas territory, takes a different form than a continental colony, if you will. No? And so a little bit about Glissant, because Glissant informs a lot of the thinking that I'm doing in my work. Maybe some of you know him. He's a very important Martinican philosopher. And he has a series of terms. He's also a philosopher that I admire a lot because he wrote a lot of theory in poetic form, questioning the disciplinary boundaries that we observe. You know, like academic writing has to have a particular form, and he actually blended poetry and theory quite well. But as you can imagine, the notion of relationality that for him questioned the idea of the nation as a teleology, as a linear teleology that explain the continuity of an identity with an origin that is reiterated over time, right? The idea of relation questions that and talks about interactions and process as more important than the idea of a linear teleology, right? And so opacity he takes is a term that he actually adopts as a poetic term, but that for him means understanding that difference is always going to be there, and that in our interest of understanding difference, sometimes we flatten or we try to deny the aspects of that difference that cannot be understood by the subject that is trying to incorporate that knowledge. And finally, his notion of archipelagic thinking, which is one of his most quoted passages. And so I'm going to go over an overview over two notions of identity that have been very useful for me. He compares the idea of the root identity with the idea of the relation identity. And for him, the root identity is basically what we in literary studies will describe usually as the national identity, right? Is there's the idea that there is a distant past, a myth of origin, nations obviously emerge out of violence, but there's a myth that is created that talks more about the heroic formation of the nation than about the violence behind it. There is a claim to land, right? Borders and land that are associated with the particular national identity. And so there's this idea that through the creation of a past and the holding of a territory, there is an identity that's articulated, and that's what provides a continuity, right? He compares that with the notion of the relation identity, that it's based on the interactions more than on the idea of a past that is projected, that there's a linear continuity into the present, right? There is no link to the possession of land as a territory as a way of legitimizing an identity. And there's the idea also that an identity can be formed through the displacement in space and time. So there's not necessarily the location in one place what is going to give a particular identity its legitimacy, right? And so, and this is the paragraph that almost everybody quotes when they refer to the archipelagic mode of thought in Edouard Glissant. And one of the things that I find interesting is that he's interested in ambiguity, fragility, its derivative drift that yields to the practice of rerouting, which is neither flight nor renunciation. It acknowledges the scope of the imaginary constructions of the trace, which it ratifies, and there you can see the poetry, right? And so he also thinks about the idea of opening, you know, becoming open, and the process has been more important than the particular notion of continuity. And so he poses in Traité de tout monde, he's trying to pose a different form of thinking that will be open to this ambiguity and this movement and this interaction in multiple sources of difference as an alternative mode or alternative model to think about the articulation of identities, right? And so in that regard, that's why his thinking has been so foundational in my work. So to give you an example of how this works, you know, what happens when we try to move from the linear thinking, and this comes, you know, I'm trying to think about my own training in which I was asked, you know, to like know the history of my discipline, learn the process in which things, you know, we have come from one point to another, and sort of like reach a very capacious close reading of a text to yield a meaning, no? to give the answer if you want, and to give an answer that will change over time, but in a way it will be like a complete answer when I'm approaching a text, right? And so I'm going to give you a simple example of the ways in which thinking archipelagically have changed the way I do my work. When we approach a problem or a situation, we usually try to come up with a definition, right? Some people tend to do the historical development of meaning over time, which is the etymology of a word. That etymology could be in one language, or it could be more than one language. Then we create different taxonomies, no? And here we have like oceanic archipelagos, continental archipelagos, to actually create different categories that will allow us to create, to understand subdivisions of a particular definition. And but there's this idea that in a way there is a set or a stable meaning that is established over time and that can be sort of like traced over time, right? When we do work with translation, this is with Google Translation. I was playing with the notion of archipelago. You can actually go to the different, you can actually ask Google Translate to give you the different words that in different language could mean archipelago. But when I found out when I was doing that is that actually many of the terms that I was finding do not allow me to make the kind of etymology that we're used to construct, right? This is the traditional etymology that goes to like the first time in which a term got found and basically traces the development of the meaning over time. If we do what I call a pluriversal, and this is a term that I'm using from Mignolo, the colonial theory, this is not mine, right? But if we use what I call a pluriversal etymology, you look at the different terms that appear. Some of them appear in Google Translate, but others appear, I found them as I was reading about archipelagos, and I found terms that were used by the different theorists and thinkers that were trying to think about the notions of clusters of islands in their own cultures and in their own languages. And so you come up with a series of terms, and some of them are like, like Antilles sounds closer to archipelago, but something like Tuvalu, which means 8 standing together and refers to a particular archipelago, it's different from archipelago itself, right? And so the invitation that for me, thinking archipelagically makes possible is to actually think about terms in relation, no? And here, please ignore the size. Word clouds, tend to put size because they're based on the amount of times that you use a particular term. That was not necessarily my intention. My intention was more to think about all of these terms in relation, and in some cases in imperfect relation. And what will happen if instead of finding one meaning that travels consistently over time, I was trying to engage in many different meanings that may change over time, that may not be exact, and that they're interacting as we put many of these artists and thinkers together, right? As we work with them together. So speaking about confederations, I'm going to share briefly some sections of the work that I'm doing on confederations as an example of the kind of engagement that I want to try in my next book. And so what I'm doing in the chapter, the first chapter, as I mentioned before, is I go back to 2 particular moments in the Caribbean. There are many more than 2, but I chose 2 that are named very similarly, in Spanish Confederación Antillana, and in English, the West Indies Federation. And I actually looked at cultural productions from that time period in which, moments in which the Caribbean is trying to create clusters of islands as a single political unit, trying to actually advance a common political project, right? And so the Caribbean Confederation was imagined. It was never a political reality, but it was an utopian imaginary that was put forth between the 1860s and 1898. The idea was to create a multi-state political and symbolical project. It included what we name as the bigger Antilles in the Spanish Caribbean, which is Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. But then it also had to include Haiti because those are the 3 major islands. Interesting enough, Jamaica was not included in that project. And so the idea of the Caribbean Confederation was to articulate a separate political unit that will allow the Hispanic Caribbean to separate from Spain. And the argument was that by following the example of Haiti and by joining forces, a region that was weaker politically could actually create an autonomous region that could basically secede from Spain and create its own political unit. That is very different from what happens almost a century later, from 1958 to 1962. The West Indies Federation did exist as a political unit. It was supported by the British metropolis as a way to facilitate the administration of the region. It included 10 of the countries of the English Caribbean. but it lasted only 4 years and ended when these bigger islands separated in order to become national states, right? And so one thing that I found when I was writing about these two particular projects is that because of the separation of our fields or our disciplines, very few people in Caribbean studies study these two confederations together. So I actually organized a series of panels. We had a special issue in Small Acts, trying to make the people who work on the West Indies Federation have conversations with people who work on the Caribbean Confederation, and to look at the similarities more than the differences, right? Because one of the things that makes it interesting is that both federations end up not succeeding because they could not imagine a common racial imaginary. You know, the racial tensions in the region did not allow them to come up with like a common racial imaginary that would make the articulation of a confederation possible or durable. But one thing that is interesting about these confederations is that the writers and the artists keep coming back to this particular moment in history and use it as an inspiration in many texts in the time period, produced during the time period of the confederations, and then in the present. Many writers go back to the confederation and recreate it in fiction. And so what I do in chapter 3 is I'm looking particularly, I'm going to give you 2 of the examples that I'm using because there are many texts in that chapter. But one of the examples that I'm using is a book by Lola Rodriguez de Tio. She's a very important political figure, an activist and a poet who participated in the political movement for independence in Puerto Rico. As a result of that participation in the political movement of independence, she had to exile herself and interestingly enough ended up in Cuba. And so from Cuba, she produces this book entitled Mi Libro de Cuba, My Book of Cuba, that is full of a series of poems that have been traditionally read as examples of nationalist imaginaries in the case of Puerto Rico. And in some cases, many people quote a poem by hers that talks about the similarities between Cuba and Puerto Rico. When I went to read the book, however, one of the things that I found interesting is that instead of talking about her, a woman that is working towards the independence of Puerto Rico, instead of talking about Puerto Rico as her nation, as a place of origin, as a root identity, what she's doing in these poems is actually talking about her double alliance to Cuba and Puerto Rico as belonging, as a place of belonging for her, no? And so she talks about both of them. She says, I do not feel like a foreigner under this Cuban sky. Everything is a brother that reigns in my heart, you know? And the very famous, at the end, there's this famous stanza that has even become a song. Cuba and Puerto Rico are the two wings of one bird. They receive flowers and bullets on the same heart. Of course, the flowers and the bullets, she's talking about the struggle for independence. But in her poems, she basically reiterates that she doesn't belong to one single place, but it's actually the Caribbean is her place of origin, and that she identifies with more than one place as her place of origin, and that she actually feels affection towards more than one place, no? And so if I think about the archipelago as a model, it actually questions the idea of only one single nation as the place of identification. She dedicates a poem to Cuba and another poem to Puerto Rico, no? And she talks about both as she says, for today, Puerto Rico and Cuba are my two great loves, no? And so she talks about, at the end, she also says, what does it matter if she adores you? It will be in vain for her to be absent in the clearings of her mind, and from the sun to the reflections from near far, she will have your image present, right? And so there's this idea that it doesn't matter, there's a lot of traveling taking place, displacement, imaginary and real, but for her, she doesn't feel the absence of Puerto Rico because she thinks that by being in Cuba, and by being in the Caribbean, there is a common understanding, there is a common denominator that allows her to feel at home. And so that's a kind of reading that I would like to showcase more than the nationalist reading that showcases a singular national identity as more important than this multi-local identity, as an example. The other case that I studied, there's a lot of songs in the Anglo-Caribbean. It was very difficult to find references in literary texts that were too explicit about the Federation. I found references in poetry and in song. This one I like to share because it's actually a very fun example. It's a woman from Grenada talking to a woman from Trinidad. They're both, dating the same man, which is not an innovative narrative by any means. But what is interesting is that the Grenadian woman is warning the Trinidadian woman that they're about to reach the moment in which the Federation is going to be articulated. And when that happens, then she will have the same rights as the Trinidadian woman, no? And so there is a whole conversation in the song about the dynamics between the smaller and the bigger islands, which is actually still a problem. Not only was that a problem in the Caribbean Confederation, because the smaller islands, the bigger islands actually left the Confederation because they felt that they should have more representation and more resources than the smaller islands, no? But that's not only a problem in the past, it's still a problem in the present, and still a problem in the work that we're doing in Caribbean studies, where there is this tendency to privilege the bigger islands as a object of study, right? But it's interesting that this woman, and to defend her right to this man, reminds this Trinidadian woman, when the Federation happens, I will be the same as you. And so I found that as a very interesting angle to the conversation of the Confederation. And so in the next chapter, as I mentioned, what I do is I move to contemporary texts that go back to the Confederations and try to look at that utopian moment as a point of departure to think about the complications. I'm trying to avoid the narrative that celebrates the Confederation as a moment of communality and homogeneity, and basically look at texts that look at the Confederations as a moment where all of these differences come out and make very difficult to talk about the region as a unity, but there's still this desire to work with these tensions and complications. And so I'm going to share one of the examples from that chapter. Tiffany Janique is a writer from the US Virgin Islands, and she has in this collection of short stories, a story that is called The Bridge Story. And that story takes place in the Virgin Islands, St. Croix, and it takes place in June, in the night of July 3rd to July 4th. And so what she's doing is she's taking advantage of the fact that this region has been a colony of the Spanish, the English, the Dutch, the French, the Danish, and then the US, right? And July 3rd is Emancipation Day, which is the day in which slaves were emancipated in the Anglo-Caribbean. Whereas obviously the 4th is Independence Day in the United States. So that's the day in which the action is taking place. And so what I do there is look at the format, the structure of how the archipelagic is articulated in narrative. In particular, what I call narrative imbrication and narrative juxtaposition. And I'm going to explain what do I do with that. The relation as juxtaposition is basically putting together or putting in contiguity different moments, colonial moments, cultural moments, languages, etc. Just putting them together, trying to make a reference to the situation in the Caribbean, where many different populations came together, where there has been many layers of colonialism taking place, sometimes in different countries, sometimes in the same countries or same islands, right? And just looking at what that sedimentation of those different experiences has in the formation of a narrative. The other articulation that she does is relation as imbrication. And so what she does there is that she takes four different vignettes, and in each one of the vignettes, there is a separate story that could live on its own, basically, but we as readers start noticing intersections between one story and the other, moments in which characters from one story maybe passes by the character of another story. They may not recognize each other, but we do. And so it's that particular process of imbrication that I find an interesting gesture or strategy that I think that the author is trying to explore with us, no? So what is the content of the story? In the four vignettes, this is what happened. In the first one, there is an artist who is invited to build a series of bridges. He actually builds jewelry, but he's invited to build a series of bridges to connect the different islands of the Caribbean. And so trying to leave a legacy, he does that, but he's not an architect. That's not his, his area. So he ends up building these bridges that are delicate and beautiful, but they're not going to survive. So it's a metaphor to the Confederation, its beauty, but also his vulnerability. Second story is a Muslim woman that travels from Dominica to St. Croix. And in this particular, she's trying to go back to her family, return back to her husband. This is a family that has a lot of religious diversity, referring to the religious diversity in the region. She comes back, cannot find her husband at home, decides to go to the bridges that are about to be inaugurated, and thinks that she sees her husband with another woman in a boat, and decides to jump out of the bridge. Vignette number 3 is a fisherman and his son. This family is a family that is imploding. The fisherman's wife has left him the night before, and before leaving him for another man, she actually tells him that his son that he has raised is not his biological son. And so we actually, in that vignette, witness the father and the son spending the last day that they're gonna be together, because the next day his son goes to college in the US, but they're trying to basically make sense of the family imploding and trying to sort of rebuild the relationship. And they decide to go out fishing, and they see out of a sudden a woman jumping out of a bridge, which is Margot, the woman from the previous vignette. And then the last vignette it's the protagonist is a Puerto Rican woman that lives in St. Croix, and that's trying to win the Miss Emancipation, pageant. But it's an exploration about the different forms, the islands that are colonies of the United States, and the differences of the identities, because this Puerto Rican girl realizes that she cannot represent the ideal image of Caribbeanness for people from St. Croix, and she cannot represent emancipation of slavery, because as a Puerto Rican, as a woman from the Hispanic Caribbean, she looks more like a white Creole woman than an Afro-Caribbean woman. And there is some conflict there, right? And so the vignette starts with the idea, this bridge maker that made bridges, and people put in their earlobes and around their fingers. And so he has this invitation paid for by the Yankees, not to honor his memory, but really for their own convenience. He builds this huge bridge stretching from Guyana, the place in the world most south, to Miami, the place in the world most north. And before allowing the public to walk on the bridge, he gathered all his family onto it for a picture. But the bridge was built like his others, and the only way he knew how, delicate and pretty, but not able to be weight. And so as from the beginning, we know that all of the bridges are going to collapse, right? And so that's the opening of the story. And actually, there is a foreshadowing that all the different connections that we see in the stories are going to collapse at the end. And so in the case of Margot, as I mentioned before, there is a complication. Not only the nuclear family is not working, but there is a religious crisis in the family. She has moved, she's originally from Dominica. She converts, and she's Pentecostal, converts to Muslim to marry her husband. And then her son is a Rasta, and her daughter is converted to Christianity. So not only the nuclear family is exploding because the father and the mother cannot get along, but it's more like the religious difference that is internal to the family is actually making the relationship explode. And I already explained what's happening with Sally and Tony. What I forgot to mention here is that when they see that when Tony is the son, sees Margot jump out of the bridge, he tries to save her, and it's ambiguous in the story if he survives or not. So here we have two stories that intersect and can have fatal consequences, right? If Tony doesn't survive. And then in the case of Guadalupe, as I mentioned before, she cannot feel that she can embody the historical reality of St. Croix, which is interesting because there's supposedly the US colonies, the US Caribbean colonies are very similar, but obviously they're not because they come from very different colonial and cultural backgrounds, right? But she's also having some problems with her boyfriend. So in a way, one thing that I found is that when you look at the affective and erotic dimensions of the stories, which is the way in which we do national-based readings or was done, at least when I started my training, the idea of the nuclear family representing the nation. In all of the vignettes, the idea of the nuclear family is in crisis. So what the story is trying to tell us is that we have to move into another model, right? A model in which these bridges falling apart and these bridges being destroyed do not become the end of the story, but the beginning of a question that shall be further explored, right? And so, so what I try to do with the different stories is look at the ways in which this narrative doesn't try to erase the differences between the different stories. Actually, each vignette could coexist on its own, right? But the idea is that putting them together, she's trying to think about the Caribbean as a region where the commonality of these multiple differences could be meaningful, could mean something. And it's the work of us, the reader particularly, to build that meaning, And so I was gonna have an intermission about the Chinese, but I'm gonna jump to the conclusion because I see that I'm running out of time. But basically what I'm trying to do with the archipelagos is to try to look at those different fragments that I share with you today and try to see them as significant, as a narrative that is incomplete, fragmentary, is not continuous. It doesn't have the teleology of the foundational narration of the nation, but it does have in its relation with different histories that are never conflated, right? It does have a proposal of a different way of thinking. And in particular for me, one of the things that I find useful is that relationality then allows us to look at those interactions, not as a place in which difference is disappears, but as a place where that difference is visible and it has to be constantly negotiated. The other contribution of the archipelagic is that I'm trying to see the Caribbean not as a place of lack, and I'm actually looking at thinking about a very useful notion by Juan Bosch of the Caribbean as a broken imperial frontier, but nonetheless as a broken thing, right? And think about this common effort or this constant effort to create meaning, or what Baldacchino describes as acting in concert, as an important and significant process as well. Not to see the Caribbean as a place of lack, but as a place of building and as a place of meaning. And finally, I'm trying to learn to read close, read differently. And in many of these texts, I have to go beyond this impulse to find a reading that will explain and answer all the questions, and instead identify some of the many different senses and multifocal dimensions of meaning, and in some cases not reach a conclusion to all of these different meanings as one reading, but simply allow us to, as readers and as thinkers, to live with that fragmentary difference as something that is part of our reality and is also significant in itself. So thank you so much.